Welcome. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. This is the November astrology forecast for 2020. I can't believe that the year is almost over. It's going to be a very active month astrologically, but really in some ways nothing compared to December. This month and year just keeps on giving. It's kind of amazing. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons for all of your support over the past months and years in many cases. If you would like to become a patron and get early access to this forecast and also exclusive access to videos, materials, my astrological illustrations, you can just visit patreon.com/Nina Griffin. All right, let's get started. So the themes of this month are quite, as I said, quite dramatic. I would say that November really represents the grand finale of the cardinal drama that really has engulfed 2020. Obviously, it doesn't mean that all of our problems will suddenly be over, I only wish, but in many ways, the first act of this grand play ends this month. Maybe we even get a little bit of an intermission, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So really the last kind of major cardinal aspect that we're experiencing, certainly among the classical planets, is when Venus squares Saturn on the 19th. So really from that point on, we start looking forward to December and some of those really deep structural systemic changes that it starts to usher in. Now, as I referred to earlier on social media, if you follow me, you will find that I see Jupiter conjoining Saturn not as a single event, but really it's kind of the first push of that long chain of dominoes that fall over. And if you remember, let's say the year 2000, the last time we had a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, that chain of dominoes goes for a long, long time. The effects stretch on for many years, if not decades. So again, if you read my November newsletter, which goes out for free, you can just subscribe at ninagriffin.com every month. I discuss the significance of changes of this Jupiter-Saturn grand conjunction cycle that's moving into the air signs. As you might be aware, for approximately 240 years, the grand conjunctions were happening in earth signs. Then in 1980, we got the one air outlier in Libra. Then in 2000, it went back into earth signs for Taurus. And now in 2020, it's in air signs for good. Now, if you're interested in this theme, again, check out that newsletter. You can also visit keplercollege.org because I gave an interview about this in the last few months of 2019 and what this shift might bring. I especially ended up talking a lot about epidemics at the time, which was sort of strangely ominous, and nobody knew about an epidemic coming, but it's one of the things that has been associated with Jupiter and Saturn going into the air signs. So what I'm trying to say here is that the astrology of November, in some ways, even though it's very dramatic, it is a bit of a sideshow, if you will, or kind of a distraction from some of the really big shifts that are coming up that are going to impact us quite dramatically. So the month really begins before it begins. What I mean is October 31st, the very last day of October, we have a full moon at 8 degrees Taurus. And I didn't discuss it in last month's video, largely because the impact of a lunation is usually felt in the 2 weeks following it. And so really, this full moon should be discussed in the context of November because that's really where its impact will be felt. Now, the lunation itself, the full moon, will conjoin Uranus, which of course suggests shocking changes and reversals. But really, with the outer planets, I always feel like they're more of a modifier of an underlying theme that is set by the classical planets. So Venus is going to be the ruler of a full moon because it's in Taurus. And so the theme for the first 2 weeks of November is going to be social harmony and the way that society shows caring for others, especially people who are vulnerable and who need help. So this is why the BLM movement was so energized during Venus retrograde, because it's really the underlying question of, how do we get along, how do we treat each other, and so on. So really that's going to be the theme for the first 2 weeks of November. How do we all get along? How are we going to exist in one society? Because Venus is about unity. Now, Venus will be in Libra, so the focus will particularly be on the judicial system and also a sense of balancing out of any previous injustices that people may have experienced. Once we get into November 1st, things start getting interesting very rapidly. Mercury will square Saturn at 26 Libra and 26 Capricorn. This to me suggests a legal or business blockage of some kind. So we certainly will be seeing more lockdowns worldwide to try to stem the spread of COVID, because remember, Mercury is commerce and business and movement. There could also be problems or delays or snafus involved with counting, paperwork of any kind, which could, I think, show potential issues with voting and vote counting in the United States. I think if we're going to see any real issues, it's going to be this first week of November. Interestingly, we're not done with Mercury square Saturn yet, and I'll explain in a minute. November 3rd, Mercury will station direct at 25 Libra on the fixed star Spica. Now, Mercury has everything to do with food in this case. This is because Spica has those significations. So in many ways, this is, okay, how do we get money to people? How do we make sure everybody has enough to eat? Those are all very Spica-related concerns. So as Mercury stations direct, we're going to get some movement forward, right? The counting of votes is going to begin around November 3rd. The analytical process, writing begins, all that kind of stuff. Now, the first week, again, as I explained, things aren't over yet. Mercury will square Saturn again, this time as Mercury is direct, at 26 Libra and Capricorn. So now Mercury will be direct, and what we'll see, I think, is a revisiting of some of those blockages and delays that we saw earlier in the week, and it's an attempt at resolution, right? We still might be sort of banging our heads against the wall, but I think there's a much better chance of getting things right and of things moving forward a little bit more constructively. Whereas when Mercury was retrograde, it's kind of like, nobody knows what's going on. You know, there's this sense of people losing their heads. Whereas with Mercury square Saturn, there is at least, I think, more of an opportunity for some constructive movement through obstacles and addressing those issues. Now, moving on to week 2, we start with November 9th, where we have Venus opposite Mars retrograde at 15 Libra and Aries. Now, this, I think, can be conflict around how well we get along as a society, and obviously this will apply worldwide, not just the United States. So any issues of equality and justice, I think, will be highlighted around this time. So you could see things like protests or vigilantism, you know, people trying to take justice into their own hands, that sort of stuff. I think places where war has been going on or conflict has been simmering will, I think, see a potential upsurge of fighting now. So if there was like a ceasefire, it could be broken now. Certainly peace and war are each struggling for the upper hand right now, but I think Venus is better positioned because she is direct. Now, November 10th, Mercury will re-enter Scorpio after having made a little bit of a toehold in Libra when he was retrograde. He's been there since late September and then most of October. So it's been a long time since Mercury was in, has really kind of been direct, and certainly, he spent a lot of time in Scorpio this year. What I think might happen is in the US, we could see a revisiting of the TikTok app ban that the US government has been trying to implement with various degrees of effectiveness. And I think there could be a renewed focus on taxes, both public taxes and taxes of certain public individuals. I think we could see a focus on that around this November 10th date. Now, November 12th and 14th have sort of a similar theme. November 12th is a big aspect. This is Jupiter conjoining Pluto at 22 Capricorn. And I have noticed that this can often indicate a change of direction for the stock market. So if it's been going down, it will start going up, and vice versa. When we had the big drop of stocks back, that started the Great Recession, what really happened, this would have been in late 2007, if I have that right, that was actually kicked off with a Jupiter conjunction to Pluto. So you do wonder if this is going to be kind of a change in the stock market direction. November 14th is the Sun sextiling this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. So I think it could actually activate it closer to November 14th with that Sun transit acting as an activating influence. November 14th also, Mars goes direct at 15 Aries, and this is huge. This is going to be a game changer in so many different ways. I think that it can be good news. I do see generally Mars going direct, usually positive, although not necessarily, and I'll explain in a minute. You know, I think if you've had some kind of simmering conflict, there is a chance for it to end now, right? There's a chance to untangle some of these knots that you've gotten yourself into as Mars is retrograde these last 2 months. But if you are Mars and you've just been waiting for a chance to make your move, it can increase the chance of war. And potentially it might help your victory as well. So certainly matters try to move forward. The one place where I think Mercury or Mars going direct can be a little bit negative is that if, for example, before Mars went retrograde, there was already a tendency to want to go to war, those 2 months of Mars retrograde may have sort of slowed that drive down, you know, slowing that roll, right? But as Mars turns direct again, that desire to go forward and, you know, invade or create conflict or whatever, that can really come back very powerfully. And you realize that those 2 months have really just been kind of a brief respite. Now in week 3, November 15th, we get the new moon at 23 degrees Scorpio. This is a Mars-ruled new moon because it's in Scorpio, which is ruled by Mars. And that means that if the first 2 weeks of November were focused on Venus issues, they will now be focused on Mars issues. That's the rest of November as an overarching theme. So issues of conflict, competition, winning, and losing are going to be really big right now. The new moon itself makes no major aspects or hard aspects, which I think are the ones that tend to really be noticeable. But its ruler Mars is stationing direct, of course, and he is square Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. So in many ways, this week is really the grand finale that we've been anticipating, right? Mars has been really itching for that final dramatic showdown, and he tries to get that the last 2 weeks of November, but he loses. He is severely outgunned by what I would call the coalition in Capricorn. All those heavier planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, which are also much better positioned in terms of an overcoming perspective, are really going to crush Mars, and it's going to be what I would consider an embarrassing defeat of the Mars principle. So this is why I've been telling you all year, or the second half of the year, don't be Mars this fall, because you are going to get in a lot of trouble and it's going to be super embarrassing. Now, November 15th, same day, Venus will square Pluto at 22 Libra in Capricorn. And then the next day, the 16th, she will square Jupiter at 23 Libra in Capricorn. So again, we are dealing with issues of spica, we are dealing with issues of food and healthcare and all those things that people need to survive and thrive. Now, what I think we could see are things like protests and legal actions, I think largely in some ways as a power play, because that's Pluto's influence, right? So this is kind of like putting on a show in order to look like you still have some strength and all that. I think Venus is better positioned in some ways than Mars, but I think in general, this is, you know, like I said, Mars is already losing, right? So Venus could be an attempt to try to save face, but I'm not sure it's really going to make much of a difference. In the third week, we start with November 19th, which is Venus square Saturn at 27 Libra in Capricorn. This is the day, what I would call the final determination. This is the last standalone major classical aspect of the visible planets that brings all the cardinal drama to an end this year. The bulk of it is over. There are still things coming up. There is a Mars square Pluto aspect at the very end of the month, but by itself, it doesn't mean a whole lot, right? Really, I think after November 19th, if you're paying attention, the transition to that Jupiter conjunct Saturn in Aquarius era really will noticeably start after that point. So the analogy that I used in my newsletter this month was, you get all of these really intense aspects. It's kind of like listening to a really dramatic, loud, cinematic score in a movie that comes to an abrupt halt. And it's a little difficult to know, is that silence about, are we just so exhausted there's nothing left to say? Or is it more the silence of tension? I think it's probably the former. I think it's just things play themselves out, and now it's just this kind of like, okay, I have nothing more to say, nothing more to give. It's just whatever happens, happens. Now, there are a few events that we get astrologically after the 19th, but they really are either minor or they start playing out more in December. So November 21st, Venus will enter Scorpio. And that can often usher in approximately a month where we get like sordid revelations or ugliness of sexual scandal. Personally, on a personal level, it can be a chance to encounter one's dark side, things that we have sort of swept under the rug. Hopefully in a constructive way, we can encounter it rather than in a destructive way. Now, same day, November 21st, the sun will enter Sagittarius. So this often can mean that like the overall public mood starts being a little more energized and cheerful, whether appropriately or not, but that's kind of the vibe that we get with sun in Sag. So the last big aspect that I really want to highlight for you, or the event, is the eclipse on November 30th. Now, it's a penumbral lunar eclipse, which means it's not considered very strong as far as eclipses go. It's not like a total eclipse, but it is an eclipse, and it does occur at 8 degrees Gemini. So again, it makes no major aspects to the classical planets. And its ruler is going to be Mercury, who is in Scorpio. So because it's going to be a mercurial first 2 weeks of December, really, we will see an increased focus on communication, commerce, the idea of accounting, because that's what Mercury does. He likes to count things and organize them and tally. And also, there is a focus on Mercury's upcoming transition into Sagittarius. So a lot of the themes that we've been sort of stuck with since late September, when Mercury entered Scorpio, are now going to be sort of put behind us for good as we get into early December. And I think this eclipse really helps put a bow on that particular experience, right? Ties that up and puts that package back in the closet. So the countries that might well be impacted the next 2 weeks because they are associated with Gemini is, you could see parts of Italy be impacted, Belgium, the West and Southwest United Kingdom, and London particularly, which is interesting because, of course, now is the time when the UK is going to be truly leaving the Union. I mean, they have already left officially, but now are some of those commercial and financial implications that many people have been dreading for so many years. The other country that's associated with Gemini historically is Armenia, which is, of course, extremely interesting given that they've been in this conflict with Azerbaijan over the last couple of months. I would be very concerned with this eclipse that it inflames that conflict. Generally, eclipses add drama, right? And even though it may not be lasting effects, but it's going to be the kind of thing that sort of gets everybody riled up. And I think there is a chance that, at least in the short term, that conflict will get more fuel. And it might be happening sort of more openly now because that's the nature of Sagittarius. Also, Sagittarius rules projectile weapons, right? It's the bow and arrow of the centaur. And so often shooting, it starts to be much more of a shooting war. Previously, it was more of a drone war. Now, really, the guns come out. So it's generally not the kind of placement I like to see when we're talking about warfare and conflict. All right, so that's it for November. I think it's going to be an exciting month, but in some ways, like I said, it's, as I said earlier, it's really kind of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? The Titanic event really happens in December, or that process, I should say, really begins at that time. So in some ways, it's not that it doesn't matter what happens in November, but in some ways it also feels like it's a foregone conclusion. And now there's just a lot of, beating one's chest and putting on a show. But the real changes are already set, and they're going to start happening really in December and in the following months. All right, thank you for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.